The restaurant was crowded, lights glinting off silver cutlery, and the murmur of elegant voices filled the air. But silence fell like a blade when the waitress handed the bill to the young woman in a simple dress and a shy look. She rummaged in her worn purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills and coins that clinked on the table, missing the bill. Discreet chuckles turned into outright laughter. A woman with a sparkling necklace whispered loudly, "If you can't pay, you shouldn't have come in here in the first place." The manager, with an impatient expression, crossed his arms in front of her. The young woman's face flushed, her hands trembled, and her teary eyes begged for a moment of compassion. But the cruel laughter of those around her grew louder, making her shame a public spectacle. Suddenly a firm voice broke the general laughter. "Her account is with me." Everyone turned in disbelief to the man in the impeccable suit who had just stood up amid the powerful men in the room. His watch glinted in the soft light. Everyone recognized him immediately. He was the most talked-about millionaire in the city, whose fortune and influence made headlines. The manager swallowed hard, his expression changing in seconds. The young woman, still in shock, looked up and found in him not just a gesture of generosity, but something enigmatic, as if he knew more than he let on. The room, which seconds before had suffocated her with contempt, now plunged into an awkward silence, and for the first time, the cruel laughter turned to discomfort. If this story has already caught your attention, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The New York night seemed tailor-made for those who believed that power and money were the only keys to respect. Outside the most exclusive restaurant on Fifth Avenue, luxury cars lined the streets like war trophies, each gleaming under artificial lights that mimicked stars. The air carried the expensive perfume of the ladies and the scent of cigars that discreetly escaped from within the dining room. Inside, everything was a stage for a spectacle of status. Round tables covered in impeccable white tablecloths, chandeliers hanging like crystal waterfalls, waiters moving with the precision of dancers, and a soft piano that seemed to bow to the pride of those gathered. Amidst this sea of ostentation, the young woman sat alone, pressed against her chair as if she didn't have enough room to breathe. Her presence clashed with everything. While the coats were made of expensive furs, her simple dress seemed to scream poverty, even though it tried to be discreet. There was an effort in him, a care, as if he had spent hours primping in front of a small mirror, yet still unable to erase the marks of simplicity. Every glance that fell upon her was filled with judgment, as if everyone wanted to guess what someone like her was doing there, alone in that temple reserved for the powerful. She breathed deeply, trying to convince herself she was just another client, but the truth was, she felt like an intruder who had crossed the wrong gates. Meanwhile, in the background, the millionaire chatted, surrounded by other men in suits, his every word eliciting fawning smiles and hasty toasts. His presence commanded respect, and his image had graced so many magazine covers that even those who had never seen him in person could recognize him in seconds. But for him, it was all routine. The expensive food, the looks, the reverence. A stage that no longer held anything new for him, even if he pretended to enjoy the show. The young woman, however, felt invisible until the moment she became the center of attention, not for what she said, but for what she couldn't offer. As she asked for the bill, she felt a chill creep across her body as her fingers touched the crumpled bills in her worn purse. She already knew it wouldn't be enough, but still she tried to piece it all together, like someone trying to glue a vase. Already in pieces. The waiters approached with the rigid posture of those who don't tolerate slip-ups, and the eyes around her, previously indifferent, lit up with the expectation of a cruel spectacle. There was no compassion, only the hunger for the laughter of those who had never had to count coins. The humiliation lay not only in the missing amount, but in the way the entire room seemed aligned to turn her into a joke. With each passing second, her breathing grew heavier, and the distant sound of the piano seemed to mock her attempt to remain steadfast. It was at that moment, amidst the heavy silence that preceded the final blow, that an unexpected gesture would begin to change the course of that night, crossing the destinies of two worlds that should never meet, at least not under such unequal circumstances. From a young age, life had taught her that dreams were expensive, and that for some, like her, the price was almost always impossible to pay. She grew up on the outskirts of a small rural town, in a wooden house that seemed to creak with pain every harsh winter. Her father left when she was still a child, leaving behind only a hazy memory of unfulfilled promises and the blurred image of a man too tired to fight. Her mother, with calloused hands and a perpetually hunched back, did everything she could to support her daughter, cleaning the homes of families who lived in worlds she could never reach. Still, there was love, there was affection, but love, however. Strong didn't fill the table with food or pay for school notebooks. The young woman learned early on to wear donated clothes, often too big for her frail body, and to swallow the shame of being called the poor girl in class. While other girls paraded around with new backpacks and shiny shoes, she settled for what still stood the test of time, and it was in this daily contrast that her quiet courage was born. It wasn't courage made of shouts, but of firm looks, of resolute steps, even when everyone around her tried to reduce her to nothing. In the school hallways, she heard laughter and cruel comments that left invisible but profound marks. It was also there that she developed the habit of observing more than speaking, learning to decipher the hidden intentions behind every smile. This silence, which many mistook for shyness, was actually a form of armor. As she grew older, she carried with her this ability to see beyond what others showed. But poverty wouldn't leave her alone. While some dreamed of parties or trips, her greatest dream was to be able to pay for college and ensure her mother no longer had to work until she was exhausted. Every extra hour of work, every coin saved in a jar hidden in the closet, was part of a secret plan to change her destiny. When her mother fell ill, that dream shattered. Medical bills consumed everything they had saved, and the young woman had to choose between studying or caring for the woman who had been her only safe haven. She didn't hesitate. She dropped everything to become a full-time caregiver, plunging into a routine of hospitals, medications, and sleepless nights. The sparkle in her mother's eyes was her only fuel, and even when the inevitable happened, even when she was alone in the world, she promised herself she would honor all the sacrifices they had made. New York appeared as the promise of a new beginning, however cruel. The city shone like gold, but every street hid traps ready to swallow those who had nothing. The young woman made do as best she could. She worked as a waitress, cleaned offices, worked endless shifts that left her feet burning, but she never stopped believing there was something greater waiting for her. She kept a notebook full of notes, business plans, and ideas that she scribbled in her few free hours, like someone keeping the flame of a different future alive. It was this flame that kept her going, even when the cold crept in through the window of her small rented room. Even when her stomach ached with hunger, each scar in her history made her stronger, but also more vulnerable to the traps of others' arrogance. And it was precisely this combination of courage and fragility that placed her, that night, facing the cruel laughter of strangers and the enigmatic gaze of a millionaire who, unbeknownst to him, was about to see his own world turned upside down. That night hadn't been chosen at random. The restaurant, a meeting place for the city's elite, was also a stage for subtle displays of power, where every look, every word, and even every bottle of wine opened carried the intention of demonstrating superiority. The millionaire, surrounded by investors and friends who thrived more on his influence than on the dinner itself, enjoyed the attention, even as he silently grew bored with the repetitive game. It was one of the men at the table, a real estate mogul known for his venomous sarcasm, who noticed the presence of the lonely young woman at a distant table. "Look at that. It seems even Charity decided to sit at the table today," he commented loudly enough for everyone to laugh. The millionaire didn't laugh, but neither did he interrupt. Another, bolder man suggested amid the laughter, "I bet she doesn't even have the money to pay what she asked for. I wonder if she'll try to escape through the back door." The joke spread, fueling a silent wager. Glasses were raised in mocking toasts, and each, with a knowing look, waited to see if their guess would be confirmed. The young woman, oblivious to what was being plotted against her, finished her simple meal, a dish carefully chosen to fit within the small sum she had saved that week. She mentally counted every penny, trying to convince herself she had enough. But she didn't know the prices had changed, that the included tax would make the difference between dignity and shame. When the waiter deposited the bill on the table, her heart raced. Trembling fingers removed the folded bills from her purse, and for a moment she believed it would work. But when the total was read aloud, he realized she was missing precious dollars. The laughter that echoed from the table at the back was no coincidence. They had expected it. The tycoon, with a cruel smile, tapped the millionaire on the shoulder and said, "See, I told you so. These people come into places like this just to expose themselves to ridicule. You want to bet they'll beg for a discount?" The millionaire, still silent, watched. His eyes fixed on the young woman captured something the others didn't. The way she bit her lip to hold back tears, how she desperately tried to maintain her dignity before the audience that turned her into a spectacle. With every second, the restaurant's hubbub transformed into an arena of humiliation. The laughter, which had previously been muffled, now rose up shamelessly, as if her embarrassment were a permitted diversion. Even the pianist, disconcerted, missed a few notes, sensing the tension in the room. The manager approached impatiently, his rigid posture confirming there was no room for negotiation. "Miss, we need full payment, now." The words fell like a sentence. She tried to argue, to show she wasn't trying to deceive anyone, but her weak voice was drowned out by the venomous laughter echoing from the table of the wealthy. For them, it was just a game. For her, it was the world crumbling before everyone's eyes. The millionaire, still motionless, felt the pressure of the eyes waiting for his reaction. It was as if the bet wasn't just on the young woman, but also on him. To what extent he would allow himself to laugh at the downfall of someone who didn't belong in that universe. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would mark the beginning of a change no one there could have foreseen, a silent turning point that would be born of humiliation and transformed into poetic justice. The silence that fell over the room after the manager's demand seemed to weigh more heavily than the sound of laughter. The young woman remained motionless, staring at the insufficient bills on the table, as if she could, by some miracle, make them multiply. Her teary eyes tried to hide the pain, but her breathing betrayed the suppressed desperation. It was then that a chair scraped softly across the room, and a man stood up. The discreet sound echoed like thunder. Everyone turned to him. It was the millionaire, with his impeccably tailored suit and the posture of someone who had never needed to ask permission to be heard. His gaze swept the room calmly, but there was a firmness that silenced even the most daring. "I'll take care of it," he said simply, but charged with unquestionable authority. The manager's expression immediately changed, as if he had received an order he dared not contradict. The group of friends at her table chuckled, as if expecting some kind of impromptu romantic scene, but his tone held no hint of play. It was direct, almost cold. The young woman slowly raised her eyes, and when their gazes met, time seemed to slow. There was no immediate gratitude, no smiles of relief. What there was surprise, distrust, and a thread of pride that prevented her from accepting easily. She opened her mouth to say something, but her voice faltered. He simply approached, discreetly handing the card to the manager, his eyes never leaving her. "I have her bill. Settle it now." The silence spread again, heavy, as if every customer in the restaurant was watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. For a moment, she felt even more exposed, not by the debt, but by the way her dignity seemed to be redeemed in front of everyone, as if it were a bargaining chip in the hands of a man who carried power in every gesture. When payment was complete, he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, as if he had every right to occupy that space. He didn't ask permission, he simply did, staring at her as if observing a puzzle. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, finally finding her voice, albeit shakily. He inclined his head slightly, a barely perceptible smile appearing on his lips. "No one had to laugh at you." The simple phrase struck her unexpectedly. It wasn't pity, but recognition. Still, the weight of embarrassment prevented her from relaxing. She felt as if she were facing a judgment greater than that restaurant, a silent test where her dignity was at stake. He, in turn, seemed intrigued. It wasn't just the embarrassing situation that caught his attention, but the way she held herself erect, as if every muscle in her body screamed not to give in to the humiliation. There was something there that defied the logic of the cruel spectacle he was accustomed to. The waiter discreetly brought a new glass of wine to the table, as if to bring the episode to a close. But the room, even as its whispers resumed, still carried the tension of what had happened. It was as if everyone was waiting for the next move, as if this scene were merely the prelude to something greater. And indeed it was. In that moment, two worlds silently collided, that of the young woman struggling to maintain her dignity, and that of the millionaire who, for the first time in a long time, felt his attention diverted from luxury to something he couldn't buy. The silent strength of someone who, even at rock bottom, refused to break. The moment that should have ended the awkwardness, in fact, only further fueled. The cruel flame of the invisible audience amusing themselves at the young woman's expense. The payment had been made, the situation was resolved on paper, but the open wound continued to bleed under the gaze of those who knew how to remain silent. The real estate mogul, the very one who had initiated the bet, leaned over the table of the wealthy and exclaimed loudly, "Look, at last our knight in golden armor has found a damsel in distress." All that was missing was the fairy tale music. The laughter that followed wasn't just his, but everyone around them who allowed themselves to laugh, as if the millionaire's gesture had been merely a whim, an added spectacle. The young woman lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of each laugh like a stone thrown at her. It wasn't just the fact that she was poor. It was the label of freeloader that was beginning to emerge in the whispers. "Maybe she planned this all along," whispered a woman with a sparkling necklace, the same sparkle that minutes before had reflected contempt in her gaze. These girls appear out of nowhere and know exactly where to put their feet. The venom was unleashed. The entire room seemed to conspire against her, transforming her shame into a narrative of opportunism. The millionaire remained silent, but his expression hardened. It wasn't the first time he'd seen the laughter of those who thought themselves superior to everyone else, but something about that night bothered him differently. Perhaps it was the young woman's silent pride, or perhaps the echo of his own memories of being underestimated in his youth, a buried detail no one there even imagined. The young woman, trying to regain her dignity, looked up and murmured, "I never asked anyone to pay for me." The phrase echoed louder than any laughter. There was truth in her voice, a truth that silenced for a moment even the most venomous whispers. But, as always, malice didn't need much to regroup. One of the investors commented loudly enough, "If you didn't ask, you took it, and that says a lot." The words, sharp as razors, hit her in the chest. The flush on her face was no longer just from embarrassment, but from suppressed anger. She knew that, at that moment, any more intense reaction would be used against her, reinforcing the stereotype they were trying to glue onto her. The millionaire then leaned forward slightly, and without changing his calm tone said, "Funny, I haven't seen anyone here get up to help. Strange how everyone has so much to say now." The silence that followed was sharp, but it didn't last. The elite refused to be confronted, and the whispers began again, this time even quieter, like snakes slithering under the tables. The young woman felt her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. What should have been just a simple dinner had turned into a public trial. It didn't matter that she had worked all week to be there, no matter her effort or courage. To them, she was simply the intruder who had dared to tread on forbidden territory. The contempt came not only from their looks, but from the very air which seemed poisoned by malice. And it was in that moment, when she already believed there would be no way to recover what little dignity she still had, that a silent decision began to dawn within her. Not tonight, but soon, she would show everyone that their narrative was not her truth. She already knew more than she was letting on, and that would soon change the course of history. The whispers, still, echoed like invisible barbs, but the young woman, instead of shrinking, took a deep breath. Her previously tearful eyes now shone differently, not with tears, but with determination. She lifted her face, and for the first time that night, spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You think I didn't know," she said, her voice firm yet controlled. The room fell silent. Even the pianist interrupted the melody, leaving the space suspended between anticipation and discomfort. From the moment I walked in, I felt every glance, every hidden laugh, every judgment. I knew that to you I was just a joke waiting to happen. Her eyes roamed each table, meeting the gazes that quickly averted. And yet, I walked in. Not because I wanted to prove anything to you, but because I refused to believe that the world belongs only to those who can afford it. The silence was absolute. Even the manager, previously impatient, seemed to have lost his voice. She continued, her breathing controlled, as if finally releasing words long held in her mouth. Yes, I knew I was risking more than I could handle. I knew I would be watched, judged, ridiculed. But do you know what else I knew? That no matter how much you laugh at me, your laughter doesn't define who I am. There was a murmur, small, uncomfortable, as if some customers shifted in their seats, unable to bear the weight of those words. The millionaire watched her silently, with an expression few had ever seen on him: respect. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a helpless victim, but of someone recognizing strength amidst chaos. She rested her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, and added, I always knew I would be humiliated, because people like you need to laugh at someone to feel bigger, but deep down I was already prepared. The difference is when you're gone, when this dinner is just a memory, I'll still have myself. And you, what will you have besides your masks? The impact was devastating. Those last words fell like stones into a silent lake, creating ripples that spread to every corner of the room. No one laughed. No one dared respond. The audience, which had previously been laughing, now hid behind glasses and cutlery, like children caught in the middle of a cruel prank. The millionaire, who until then had remained an active spectator, felt a lump in his throat. The world he lived in rarely allowed this kind of frankness. He was accustomed to seeing people bow before him, seeking favors or approval. But there, before that penniless young woman, he saw something rare, a courage that wouldn't break, even under humiliation. The young woman then leaned back slowly in her chair, unsmiling, unseeking approval. There was no need. She wasn't speaking to win anyone over. She spoke because it was the only way to keep herself together. The atmosphere, once filled with venomous laughter, was now heavy with collective shame. And deep down, everyone knew. She had seen through them from the first moment. That night, after the tension in the restaurant, the millionaire couldn't get the image of the young woman out of his mind. Her firm gaze, the words that shattered the room like blades, it wasn't common. He was used to seeing people bow, beg, and smile in a forced way to protect themselves. But not her. She had faced contempt with the naked truth, without needing to raise her voice, and it stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in years. The next day, between meetings and appointments, his mind still returned to that scene. Driven by a curiosity he didn't want to admit, he discreetly asked one of his assistants to find out who the young woman was. The result came quickly, and when the first reports arrived, the shock was inevitable. She wasn't just a poor girl. Her name had already appeared in academic records, recognized in the past as one of the best students in her school. She had won essay contests, math Olympiads, and had even received a scholarship to study at one of the best universities in the country. But she never managed to secure the position. The reason was there, clear as daylight. Her mother had fallen gravely ill, and she had abandoned everything to care for her. He read and reread the report, as if it were the script of a tragic film. Each line seemed to dismantle the image others had tried to paint of her. She wasn't an opportunist. She was someone who, faced with the choice between the future and love, had chosen love. And she was paying the price for it to this day. But there was more. He also discovered that, in recent years, she had worked several low-paying jobs, always scraping together what she could, and that she had tried, almost alone, to start a small business selling handicrafts online. The detail that surprised him most was that, in an interview with a local newspaper in her old town years ago, she had said a phrase that now sounded prophetic. I don't want to be saved. I want to build something that no one can take away from me. The millionaire closed his eyes for a moment, feeling something strange. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was respect, maybe it was a reflection of himself as a young man before money erased his memories of humble beginnings. Because he knew, and no one in that room of investors knew, that he too had come from the bottom. The son of a factory worker and a seamstress, he had grown up in a home where the noise of sewing machines and the smell of shoe polish were part of the routine. Unlike her, he had had the opportunity to seize a chance, but he had never forgotten the silent humiliations, the stares of those who believed he would never amount to anything. Perhaps that was why her attitude had disarmed him, because he saw himself in her, like a reflection he had long tried to ignore. In that moment, he realized that it wasn't he who had saved the young woman that night in the restaurant. It was she who, with her quiet strength, had reminded him of who he truly was. And this recognition would be the beginning of a transformation no one could have foreseen. In the following days, the millionaire tried to find her again. He asked discreet contacts to find her where she lived, searched cafes and bookstores in the humble neighborhood where he'd learned she lived, but every clue vanished like smoke in the wind. The young woman had disappeared. The silence surrounding her seemed calculated, as if she'd purposefully decided to vanish, erasing any possibility of contact. And the more he tried, the more he discovered he'd been struck by something unexpected. Absence. At first it was merely curiosity, an annoyance at not being able to solve the enigma she represented. But as the days passed, he realized her absence weighed more heavily than he'd imagined. During important meetings, his mind returned to that night, to the way she'd faced everyone with dignity when she had nothing. At night, alone in his luxurious apartment, surrounded by silence and cold works of art, he remembered the power of her words, "Your laughter doesn't define who I am," echoing like a sentence he couldn't erase. Meanwhile, his life continued at the same pace as always: parties, dinners, negotiations, people laughing loudly and talking about astronomical numbers. But now everything seemed empty. He realized how forced every smile was, how calculated every word was to please or impress. For the first time in a long time, he felt the bitter taste of superficiality. It was as if he had lost an essential piece of a puzzle he had never known existed. He tried to forget, immersing himself even more in his work, but the loss only grew. One night, passing through an alley near a poor neighborhood, he saw a group of children playing on the sidewalk. One of them held a small notebook, with the young woman's name scrawled on the cover. His heart raced. Upon inquiring, he learned that she had volunteered to tutor those children for weeks, until she disappeared without explanation. The confirmation came like a blow. She had disappeared not just from him, but from the entire world, as if she had decided to protect herself in silence. The millionaire returned home with a strange feeling of emptiness. The cold marble walls, the silent corridors, and the automatic lights seemed to mock him. He had everything, but for the first time, that everything meant nothing. He missed not only her, but what she had awakened, the memory of who he had been before fortune, before the masks. And staring at his own reflection in the window with the illuminated city beyond, he realized he was alone, not because she had disappeared, but because, surrounded by people, he had never truly had anyone. Fate has a silent way of balancing the playing field, and for the millionaire the blow didn't come from where he expected. For years, his image had been built as that of an unshakable man, surrounded by power, luxury, and respect. But all it took was one slip-up, a series of misinterpreted news stories, and some uncomfortable truths that emerged from past business dealings, for his reputation to begin to crumble. Newspapers plastered his face with headlines insinuating corruption, exploitation, and unbridled arrogance. Television shows turned his life into a spectacle of judgment, and on social media thousands of people commented, some with hatred, others with venomous delight, on the downfall of the man who seemed untouchable. The same people who once vied for his smile now turned their backs on him, as if they had never sat at his table. Invitations to events evaporated, investors cut ties, and even longtime friends disappeared like shadows at sunrise. The public humiliation, which he had previously watched silently being inflicted on others, now fell upon him with an unbearable weight. In that same city that had applauded him, he began to feel the harsh stares, the whispers, the indifference. The camera flashes, which had previously celebrated his triumphs, now sought to capture his stumbles. One night he tried to enter the same restaurant where it had all begun, but the polite and cold manager told him there was no table available, even though the dining room was half empty. The message was clear. He no longer belonged in that world. He walked down the illuminated street, feeling naked before the shop windows that reflected his haggard image, and deep down, he understood the bitter taste of the contempt he had previously witnessed in her skin. It wasn't just the loss of status, but the discovery that the respect that surrounded him had never been genuine. It was purchasable, conditional, and like any commodity, it could be suddenly withdrawn. The newspapers continued to exploit his downfall, and each story seemed to tear away a piece of his armor. But what hurt most wasn't public opinion, but the absence of that one person who, amidst the chaos, would have looked at him without a mask. Now he understood. That poor girl, humiliated before everyone, had faced the same arena that was now being erected against him, and she hadn't needed money or titles to stay afloat. The irony cut deep. It took losing everything to realize that the greatest luxury she could have lay not in her coffers, but in the invisible strength of her dignity. The public downfall not only shattered his image in the eyes of others, but also shattered the illusion he had nurtured for years. For the first time in a long time, the millionaire found himself alone in his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by silence and walls that seemed to close in on him. The sound of the phones that had previously rang incessantly had ceased. The invitations vanished. Even the house staff regarded him with a mechanical, empty respect that only reinforced the abyss separating him from the world. The man who had always lived amidst numbers and achievements now faced the emptiness of his own soul. He began to revisit memories he had tried to bury. He remembered his exhausted father returning from work with his hands covered in grease, his mother sewing late into the night to ensure he lacked everything. He remembered the boy who believed that, with effort, he could change his family's destiny. But somewhere along the way, he had exchanged his essence for masks, transforming himself into someone he no longer recognized. The image of the young woman in the restaurant loomed large like an open wound, but also like a beacon. He remembered her. Steadfastness in the face of ridicule, her dignity intact even when all seemed lost. He, with all his millions, possessed nothing like it. This thought gnawed at him. Days passed, and he began to distance himself from the cycle of luxury. He declined invitations, went out to walk the ordinary streets where no one revered him anymore. He felt for the first time the weight of real life, the smell of the street, the weary gaze of workers, the cold that punished the homeless. He began to donate. Silently, not to clean up his public image, but because he finally understood the pain he had previously pretended not to see. In an unprecedented gesture, he visited one of the charities he had previously funded, only to appear in the gossip columns. He sat in silence among children who laughed at little and adults who thanked him for crumbs. There he realized what he had lost, the ability to connect with humanity without intermediaries, without numbers. Each visit was a reconstruction. Each step outside the luxury bubble was a reminder of who he had been. The nights, once filled with parties and business, were now occupied by long reflections in front of the mirror. He no longer saw the powerful millionaire, but a man marked by emptiness and the need to find redemption. What hurt most was her absence. He sought her not only because he was fascinated, but because he knew he needed to learn from that silent strength. And deep down, he feared he would never find her again. For the first time, he desired not to conquer, not to possess, but simply to be seen by someone who had already seen what lay behind all the masks. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious salon, nor amid the artificial lights of high society. It was on a grey afternoon when the city seemed tired of itself that the millionaire saw her again. She was walking unhurriedly through a simple neighborhood, carrying grocery bags in her hands, her hair tied up unpretentiously, her face free of makeup. Yet there was the same dignity about her that had disarmed him that night in the restaurant. He stopped immediately as if time had grounded his feet. He watched her for a few moments before approaching, afraid that any movement would be enough to push her away for good. When he finally summoned the courage, his voice was lower than usual. "You—" She turned slowly, recognizing him immediately. There was no surprise in her gaze, only an almost uncomfortable calm, as if she'd expected their paths to cross again at some point. "I've heard of you," she said without irony, but with the firmness of someone who hasn't forgotten the wounds of the past. He took a deep breath. "And I've heard a lot about you too. More than you realize." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what exactly do you think you know?" The silence between them seemed to weigh more heavily than the words. He wanted to say everything, about the research he'd done, about the respect that had been born within him, about the transformation his absence had wrought. But the words didn't come out as planned. "I know you're stronger than everyone in that room combined, and I know you didn't deserve to go through what you went through." She stared at him for long seconds, as if measuring each gesture to understand his true intention. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was no trust either. People only show who they are when the world is watching. That night, everyone showed. You too. The sentence hit him hard. Because he knew it was true. He could have done more. He could have defended himself. He could have stood up against the laughter, but he preferred silence until the last moment. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice breaking. "And I spend every day since then thinking about it. That laugh wasn't mine, but the silence. The silence was mine." The confession dismantled the wall of coldness she had erected. Still, there was no automatic forgiveness. She took a deep breath, adjusted the bags in her arms and simply said, "It's not with apologies that you erase the past." The millionaire nodded. "I don't want to erase it. I want to learn from it. And if you'll allow me, I want you to know that I'm not here to offer anything, just to listen." For the first time, she looked at him without suspicion, but also without surrender. There was a space there, small, fragile, between the hurt and the possibility of something new. A space that would depend solely on her to decide whether it would be filled. The cold wind that afternoon seemed to carry with it the weight of the decision that hung between them. The young woman clutched the bags to her chest, as if they were a physical barrier to protect herself from the man who, in a way, had changed her life, and also exposed her to the greatest humiliation she had ever faced. The millionaire remained motionless, vulnerable as never before, without the walls of arrogance or the glare of the headlines that usually defended him. For the first time, he wasn't an untouchable man, but someone silently asking for a second chance to be seen. She looked away for a moment, observing the hustle and bustle of the ordinary street, children playing on the sidewalk, neighbors carrying groceries, people who knew nothing of the story that united them. Life went on, indifferent as always, and perhaps that was what gave her the courage to speak. "You say you've changed, but I learned, early on, that promises and words don't sustain anything. What really matters are choices." He swallowed hard. "Then let me prove it." She shook her head slowly, as if weighing not only the present but also the past and future in a single decision. "I don't need you to prove anything to me. I've already found my strength without you. What I need to decide now is whether I still want you to be a part of my story." The silence that followed seemed endless. He, accustomed to dictating the course of the most lucrative negotiations, now found himself at the mercy of the choices of someone who had nothing material to offer, but carried the power to give meaning to the emptiness that consumed him. "That night," she continued, "I realized two things. The first is that the world can be cruel, but dignity is something no one can take from us. The second is that even among all those who laughed, you remained silent. Silence hurts as much as contempt." The words were harsh, but there was a truth in them that he couldn't deny. The young woman took a deep breath, and then, with the calm of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, concluded, "I don't want to live a life where I have to constantly defend myself from the past. Perhaps what you need isn't my forgiveness, but your own." He lowered his head, feeling the weight of the rejection that wasn't filled with resentment, but with clarity. It was a silent goodbye, and for that very reason, all the more painful. She walked away slowly, walking down the street with firm steps, leaving him standing in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by the noise of the city, but plunged into a deafening silence. There were no tears in her eyes, only the conviction of someone who had already learned to survive alone. For him, all that remained was the bittersweet feeling of having lost something he could never buy. And in that moment, he understood. Her true decision wasn't simply between forgiveness or goodbye, but between allowing her life to be defined by the past or moving forward in peace. She chose to move on. Snow began to fall that night, covering the city with a silent veil that seemed to erase the day's scars. The millionaire walked alone through the illuminated streets, aimlessly, until he stopped in front of the window of a small neighborhood bookstore. There, among colorful covers and disorganized stacks, a notebook caught his eye. He immediately recognized the delicate handwriting scrawled on the cover, loose sentences, handwritten dreams, as if they were seeds of a future. He went in. The bookstore owner explained that a young woman had left some notebooks for sale, simple like herself, but filled with ideas that blended pain, hope, and resistance. The millionaire picked up one of the copies and leafed through it in silence. Between the pages he found the same sentence he had read months earlier in an old newspaper clipping. "I don't want to be saved. I want to build something that no one can take away from me." His eyes fixed on those words, and a bitter smile escaped, almost imperceptible. He paid for the notebook, stepped out into the cold night, and walked to a park bench. Snow accumulated on his dark coat, but he didn't move. He spread the notebook on his knees like a map, and stood there motionless, reading each line under the dim light of a street lamp. Around him the city continued its course. Cars passing, people hurried, children laughing as they played in the snow. He, however, remained silent, like a living statue marked by time. And when he closed the notebook, clutching it to his chest, there were no tears or despair, only the certainty that the world had somehow confronted him with something that all his money couldn't buy. The wind blew hard, scattering flakes over his face, and in that instant, in the contrast between the cold of the night and the invisible warmth of the words he held, the story found its end. No explanation, just a silence charged with meaning. If you've made it this far, I want to know your opinion. What would you do in her place? Write the word in the comments, dignity. Let me know you followed this story all the way through. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this helps me bring you more powerful stories like this. And now don't leave. There's already a next video playing on your screen, full of emotion and twists, waiting for you. Click and keep watching.